18 months after the passing of her older brother Mason, Leah Savage stood on the porch of the one-story house he'd left her, a coffee cup cooling in her hand, and the early October wind brushing loose strands of hair across her cheek. The house was nestled in a modest, unincorporated community about 30 minutes outside of Sedona, Arizona. Far enough from the tourist routes to feel private, but still close enough to civilization if something went wrong. Leah wasn't the kind of woman who liked people knowing when something went wrong, though. She had returned to this land with a simple goal: keep things quiet, keep things clean, and work. Mason had lived here for 16 years, fixing things, building things, and making a name for himself among the few locals who still believed in skilled hands over cheap imports. He wasn't the type to join community events or bake sale committees. He believed in boundaries and sweat equity and the value of silence. So, when the property passed to Leah, who shared many of those same traits, it wasn't entirely unexpected that she chose to stay. What had surprised people was what she chose to do with the land. Leah was a wood sculptor by trade, not by education. She had left college after 2 semesters, unable to endure the self-congratulating critiques of people who'd never even held a chisel. Her work had always been tactile, rooted in something older than trends. She didn't work with soft pine from big-box stores. She salvaged, sorted, seasoned, and dried her own hardwood. It was a long process, one her clients never saw, and that was fine by her. Mason had taught her to recognize wood not by sight, but by sound, by how a piece responded when tapped with a knuckle or dragged across the teeth of a rasp. He'd leave her messages on Post-its in the workshop. This one's from the flood season. Feel how tight the grain is. Those messages still lingered in the back of her mind when she walked past the stacked logs that lined the edge of the workshop. The logs weren't randomly strewn about, like the discarded firewood of some careless prepper. Each piece had been cut, tagged, and arranged into neat vertical stacks, categorized by type and seasoning time. There was ash from a storm-downed tree near the back road, maple from a rancher's thinning project, and an entire section of red oak she'd sourced 2 years ago from a shuttered vineyard in New Mexico. It was her inventory, her medium, and, in a way, her memory bank. She could walk along the line of stacked wood and remember the context of each haul, where it came from, what it had cost her to retrieve it, and what it might become. When the first letter arrived from the Neighborhood Management Board, a group of 6 self-appointed stewards who called themselves a Community Standards Committee, she thought it was a misprint. The envelope was thin and perfumed faintly of office paper, with the same canned language she'd seen in rental agreements and parking tickets. Visual non-compliance, it read. Property inspection determined exterior wood storage presents a visual inconsistency with neighborhood aesthetic values. She scanned the letter 3 times before tossing it aside. She wasn't storing garbage. She wasn't building a scrapyard. She was organizing her materials, as she always had, and the idea that someone had judged it offensive enough to generate a form letter seemed absurd. She went back to work. A week later, a second letter arrived, this one certified with a signature required. She signed, took the envelope, and opened it in the workshop. Notice of escalating fine. The letter stated that her property was now accruing a daily penalty of $25 for non-removal of unsightly material. No contact had been made by phone, and no one had knocked on her door. There had been no warning conversation, no clipboard-wielding inspector asking questions. Just 2 envelopes, one after the other, issued without discussion. It felt cowardly. That night, Leah couldn't sleep. Not out of fear, she wasn't afraid of a fee or some stiff-lipped woman in a blazer with a clipboard, but out of something worse. Violation. The idea that someone had come onto her land, perhaps stepped onto her porch, maybe even crept up along the gravel path beside her kiln, without so much as a knock or a call, it made her skin crawl. The workshop and the yard were private places, sacred in their own way. Mason had built that shop with his own hands. Every shelf, every beam, every light bulb was placed with intention. The idea that someone had trespassed, even in the name of assessment, felt like a crack forming in the wall of something she'd tried so hard to preserve. She tried to ignore it. For 3 more days, she kept working, planing down the surface of a basswood sculpture intended for a new client up in Flagstaff. She stacked more of the seasoned wood beneath the sloped shed roof, aligning it tighter, neater than ever before. But the tension was there. When she walked out to the road to check her mailbox, she found herself looking over her shoulder, not because she feared being watched, but because she was angry at how easily her space had been invaded without permission. On the 4th day, she found a flyer taped to her fence. This wasn't a letter or a fine. It was an invitation to a neighborhood improvement feedback session, to be held at the community hall down the hill. Asterisks covered the page like buckshot. It wasn't addressed to her or to any resident in particular. It was a generic call to action, inviting anyone who may be experiencing difficulties aligning with property expectations to attend a casual, non-confrontational Q&A. The wording made her stomach turn. That evening, Leah took a long walk past the properties lining the adjacent block. She hadn't bothered walking this loop since Mason died, but she wanted to see what the expectations looked like. She counted 6 trailers covered in blue tarps, a rusted trampoline propped sideways against a chain-link fence, and 2 front lawns scattered with plastic flamingos and solar lights shaped like mushrooms. Her stacked lumber, shaded beneath a slanted tin roof and organized in labeled rows, looked like a monk's library in comparison. It wasn't about aesthetics. It never was. She didn't go to the meeting. Instead, she spent the next day moving the lumber, not to hide it, not to comply, but to repurpose it. She started early in the morning, dragging thick cuts of seasoned wood across the gravel and laying them out on the concrete slab behind the workshop. She began sketching loosely with chalk, mapping outlines in her head, walking the perimeter of the slab and testing angles in the sunlight. She didn't speak. She didn't play music. The sound of dragging wood, the blunt percussion of pieces shifting into place, was enough to keep her grounded. By sundown, she had the basic frame in place. By the end of the 2nd day, it began to take form. She worked carefully, stacking and shaping, bolting and chiseling, carving shallow impressions where the weight of one log would rest against another. She kept the proportions human, but exaggerated the posture. A tall, straight-backed figure in a chair, hands resting on knees, shoulders squared like a school principal waiting to discipline. The face was left featureless, but the hair, made of scorched juniper and pine shavings, resembled a very specific individual, one Leah had seen in passing at the local post office, issuing directives to the part-time staff with the clipped tone of institutional authority. She said nothing to her neighbors. She didn't post photos. But by the morning of the 4th day, the calls started. It didn't take long for the message to get around. And Leah didn't take it down. Not then, not ever. It was only a few days after the completion of the sculpture that Leah noticed something strange. Not dramatic, not immediately confrontational, but odd enough to dislodge her concentration. She had stepped out early to sweep the gravel along the workshop side of the house, a habitual task that helped her gather her thoughts before working, when she noticed a patch of empty ground where there should have been wood. One of her stacks, an older set of hickory cuts already dry and prepped for shaping, was missing nearly a third of its top rows. At first, she thought it might have been high winds. The tin roof above the stack was a little loose and maybe something had shifted in the night. But there was no sign of scattered wood, no fallen bark or splinters in the gravel, no fresh abrasions in the soil. The absence was too clean. Someone had taken it. Quietly, deliberately, without a trace of mess or noise. Leah stood still for a long minute, staring at the negative space left behind. Her first instinct was to check the perimeter, walk the yard, scan the fence line, check the gates. Nothing broken, no obvious signs of intrusion, But she did find one thing unusual: a clean indentation in the gravel driveway, near the side gate that led to the back road. The imprint was shallow but unmistakable, a narrow tire tread with a ridge that didn't match any of her own equipment or carts. It curved slightly at the edge, as if something had reversed in and then slowly backed out. The air that morning had that sharp, high desert edge to it, dry and sun-bitten, but Leah felt sweat forming along her shoulders. It wasn't the theft that bothered her most. It was the silence surrounding it. There had been no note, no warning, no neighbor checking in afterward with a casual question. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't some bored teenager on a dare. This was purposeful, and done with the kind of confidence that could only come from someone who believed they were untouchable. Not just anyone could walk onto someone's land in broad daylight and carry off stacked, tagged, prepped lumber without hesitation. That kind of trespass wasn't just physical, it was psychological. It said, "We can take what we want. You won't stop us." She went inside and called Thomas Curran, her brother's former attorney. He was in his early 60s, dry-voiced and meticulous, the kind of man who had always responded to Mason's short texts with full paragraphs and follow-up clarifications. When she explained what happened, he didn't sound surprised, just very quiet. "It's starting earlier than I thought," he said after a pause, and that alone made Leah's stomach twist. "I assumed it would take longer for them to escalate." She asked what he meant, and Thomas explained in his clipped, neutral tone that, after Mason's death, there had been several revisions to the local management rules, quiet ones, passed in closed session meetings by a majority vote from the newly installed committee. Unlike past neighborhood associations, which mostly focused on road maintenance and trash services, the new board had expanded its jurisdiction. They were now positioning themselves as land use custodians, complete with a review council, fine system, and the authority to initiate external inspections in cases of community inconsistency. None of this had been directly disclosed to individual property holders unless they'd opted into paper newsletters or attended the monthly assemblies, which Leah, naturally, had not. But what concerned Thomas more was the language embedded in those rule updates. The terms removal of hazards and corrective retrieval had been added to the enforcement section, phrases that allowed the board to take unsightly or unsafe items from any visible property zone deemed in violation, with or without explicit consent. The assumption, of course, was that this applied to trash bins, broken-down vehicles, or loose fencing. But in practice, it allowed broader interpretation, especially if no one objected loudly enough to stop them. Leah listened without interrupting, pacing along the edge of her porch with the phone pressed tight against her cheek. The wood was gone. The action was legal, technically barely, and she had no immediate recourse beyond filing a formal grievance, which would then be reviewed by the same board that had likely authorized the removal in the first place. When she asked whether the police could be contacted, Thomas hesitated before responding. "They'll defer to the local board's jurisdiction, unless there's evidence of criminal damage or forced entry. But this was subtle, controlled, and if the board claims they acted under corrective authority, the sheriff's office will likely stay out of it." It wasn't justice. It wasn't even logic. It was bureaucracy, slow, blind, and uninterested in nuance. Thomas recommended she send a written inquiry requesting a record of any authorized removals on her property. He offered to draft it for her. "Keep it formal," he said. "Don't make it emotional. They thrive on emotional overreach. It lets them cast you as unstable." That last word hit her like a small slap, not because it was wrong, but because it reminded her that this wasn't about right and wrong. It was about strategy, paper trails, impatience, silence. That night, she didn't sleep again. She sat in the workshop with the lights off, staring at the places where the stacks used to be. She thought about the hours she'd spent curing that hickory, sanding off the outer bark, cataloging each piece with a faint pencil mark. She thought about the clients she'd turned down this fall, knowing she needed that particular lot for a series of architectural inlays due in February. And then she thought about the people, most likely, who had walked in without fear, without urgency, and removed it like they were taking out the garbage. The next morning, a white pickup truck drove slowly past her gate. No logo, no markings. She saw it from her kitchen window. It didn't stop, just rolled past at 5 miles an hour, windows up, tinted dark. Not unusual for a rural area, not illegal, but it was the third time in 2 days she'd seen it do the same thing. At first, she thought she was imagining it. But the pattern was too clean. Always around 8:30. Always slow. Always silent. She started locking the side gate. She installed a second camera above the tool shed and connected it to a motion sensor light. She left the sculpture intact, untouched. She told no one what she suspected, but she began recording everything. Every vehicle that passed too slowly, every footstep she heard along the fence line, every envelope in the mailbox that arrived without a return address. She didn't post online. She didn't call friends. She built a file and waited. 2 days later, another letter arrived. This time, it wasn't certified. It wasn't even folded. It was printed on heavy cardstock, hand-delivered, slipped under her door. Upcoming inspection notice, it said. External visual reassessment for regulatory compliance. Scheduled for 9 a.m. the following Tuesday. No appeal, no contact number, no signatory name, just a directive and a time. As if her property, her work, her years of labor and quiet defiance was just another entry on a checklist. She stood on the porch that evening, arms crossed, watching the sunset slide behind the hills with that heavy orange glow that turned everything momentarily gold. Somewhere out there, someone was preparing to tell her what she was allowed to see, to keep, to build, to be. Somewhere, someone had decided she was a problem to be solved. She didn't plan a protest. She didn't stage a scene. But she did retrieve the remaining half-stack of cherrywood from the storage loft behind the kiln. And she did begin shaping something new. Not to provoke, not to comply. But to mark the line between what they thought they could take and what she refused to give. Tuesday arrived like a challenge, not an appointment. Leah had been up since 5, not out of nerves, but necessity. She didn't like being caught unaware. She had spent the night tightening the gate hinges, moving tools back into the workshop, brushing away the blown dust from the gravel walkways, not to beautify the property but to make it unmistakably orderly, controlled in a way that left no room for vague interpretations of neglect or disorder. When the black SUV pulled up to the front fence at precisely 9:03 a.m., she was already sitting on the porch with a mug of cold coffee and the expressionless calm of someone prepared for unpleasant company. The vehicle's windows were so heavily tinted that for a moment she couldn't see who was inside, but the passenger side door eventually opened, and out stepped a tall, trim woman in a navy blue pantsuit, clipboard in hand, sunglasses fixed tightly too, her face, her every movement broadcast with an air of institutional purpose. She didn't walk to the gate. She stood beside the vehicle and made a small motion with her finger, beckoning Leah over like a service staffer at a hotel. Leah didn't move. She stayed seated, one ankle resting on the opposite knee, sipping from the mug deliberately, making it clear she wasn't interested in participating in the performance. The woman waited exactly 7 seconds before lowering the clipboard and walking forward, stopping just short of the gate. "Miss Savage," she said, not as a greeting but as a checkpoint. Her voice was flat, professional, with the artificial warmth of someone trained to neutralize resistance through tone alone. "I'm here on behalf of the board for a routine visual compliance inspection. You've received the notice, I trust." Leah nodded once but said nothing. The woman glanced down at her clipboard and began reading. "This visit pertains to the identification of exterior obstructions, environmental risks, or materials deemed incongruent with established visual expectations of the neighborhood code. If you prefer not to be present, I can proceed without you. Leah set her mug down slowly, stood, and walked to the gate. She didn't open it. She rested her hands on the top rail and looked the woman square in the face. Anything removed from this property without my signed consent will be considered theft, she said evenly. That includes materials, containers, or even soil samples. You document what you want. You photograph what you want. But you don't touch a single thing unless I hand it to you. The woman didn't blink. She simply turned back to the SUV and gave a short nod. Two men stepped out from the driver's side, dressed in matching uniforms with no logos. Not police, not utilities, just muscle and fitted khakis and collared shirts. Each carried a small satchel. One had a camera slung over his shoulder. The other held what looked like a compact rangefinder. Leah opened the gate, not out of deference, but precision. She wanted them to walk through the entrance to acknowledge, even unconsciously, that this was her space, that they were entering. She followed behind them, arms crossed, eyes sharp. The woman began walking slowly along the western edge of the property, stopping occasionally to write on her clipboard. She asked no questions. She didn't comment. The men didn't speak either. They simply moved like technicians. One snapping photos, the other aiming the rangefinder at various structures, noting distances. It was all very efficient, very rehearsed, and profoundly unsettling. No one had asked permission. No one had explained the scope. They were simply there, performing their little ritual of authority, because someone somewhere had decided it was allowed. When they reached the workshop, Leah stepped in front of the doorway. "Interior's off limits," she said. The woman didn't argue. She made a small note and moved on. But the cameraman lingered a half-second too long, raising the lens slightly above shoulder height before Leah stepped forward and blocked his line of sight. "No internal photos," she said, quieter now. He nodded and lowered the camera. They continued around the house, noting the sculpture but not commenting on it. The figure sat impassively in its chair, hands folded, gaze fixed on nothing. It looked somehow more dignified than the people walking past it. By the time they completed their circuit, the sun was nearly overhead. The woman returned to the SUV, conferred briefly with the men, and then approached Leah again. "You'll receive an itemized report within 10 business days. If any adjustments are required, the board will provide written instructions for compliance." She offered a paper, the same kind of trifold brochure you'd find in a waiting room. Leah didn't take it. "I'll wait for the report," she said. The woman set the paper on the gatepost and returned to the vehicle. They left without a goodbye. The silence that followed was different than usual. Not calm, not peaceful. It was the kind of silence left after a house call from people who didn't knock, didn't smile, and didn't ask questions. The kind of silence that made you check your locks even though you were home the whole time. Leah spent the rest of the day walking the property, checking for anything they might have moved or tampered with. She found nothing obvious, but near the east fence line, behind the stacked crates of reclaimed walnut, she noticed fresh boot prints. 3, overlapping, pointing toward the drainage gully. They hadn't taken anything, not this time, but the message was clear. They were watching, and they had no interest in dialogue. That night, she couldn't work. She paced the living room, sat at the workbench, started a sketch, and then abandoned it. Something about the way they'd moved, the efficiency, the silence, unsettled her. It wasn't enforcement, it was mapping, scanning, logging details for future use, not just what they could criticize, but what might later be used as leverage. The report arrived 5 days early. 7 pages, 6 photographic appendices, 3 highlighted notations marked as urgent. One concerned the unauthorized structural assembly of her sculpture. Another targeted the use of combustible organic material stored in proximity to open-air access zones. The third, most absurd, cited the potential for obstruction of visual corridors from adjacent lots, referencing how her wood storage might visually encroach upon the aesthetic unity of neighboring parcels. In short, it was a bureaucratic hit list, carefully worded to appear neutral while building a foundation for escalation. Leah forwarded it to Thomas, who replied within the hour. "This is posturing. They're preparing to either force a compliance mandate or justify a lien. I've seen this tactic used when the board wants to clear a property without triggering a formal seizure. You need to respond, but not directly. Give me 2 days." She agreed and waited. She stayed off her property line. She didn't move the sculpture. She watered her trees, answered no knocks, and filed every new piece of mail by date and sender. But on the third morning, she woke to find the south gate hanging open. Not broken, just ajar. No sign of damage, but inside the gate, carefully placed on top of the gravel, was a crumpled paper bag. Inside was a note written in tight, slanted script. It wasn't signed. It simply said, "You're making this harder than it has to be." There was no threat, no direct accusation. Just a sentence written with the unmistakable entitlement of someone who believed they were doing her a favor by trying to remove her from her own life. She didn't call the police. She already knew the answer. No sign of forced entry, probably a prank. She didn't tell Thomas, not yet. She took the note, scanned it, and burned the original in the forge. And that afternoon, she drove into town, parked 2 blocks from the real estate office that handled most of the local listings, and spent an hour walking the streets, looking at the flyers taped to windows and the signs staked into lawns. Nearly all of them had the same small line at the bottom. Visual compliance required, subject to inspection. It wasn't just her, and that meant she wasn't going to wait for them to decide the next move. She was going to make one of her own. The visit to town had been less about gathering information and more about confirmation. Leah had walked those streets not to uncover something new, but to solidify what she already suspected, that the slow erosion of individual control over private property wasn't happening in isolation. It was methodical, deliberate, and being marketed as progress. The real estate listings she'd passed in windows didn't speak of homes or land. They promised conformity, tranquility, managed appearance. The words were subtle, but their meaning was sharp. Community-integrated aesthetics, protected residential standards, neighborhood assurance. Each phrase served the same purpose, to signal that these homes belonged not to their owners, but to a curated image. People weren't buying shelter. They were buying permission. When Leah returned home that afternoon, she didn't go into the workshop. She didn't go to her computer or her planner or the box of wood samples she'd been preparing for a client in Bisbee. Instead, she walked directly to the sculpture and stared at it for nearly 10 minutes. It sat exactly where it had been. Unbothered, unchanged, patient. There was something about its posture, the unmoving poise of it, that unsettled her now more than it ever had. She had crafted it to embody mockery, to reflect the absurdity of power applied through petty bureaucracy. But now, it seemed to be watching her, mirroring back the quiet escalation of a conflict she had once believed she could dismiss with silence. The figure wasn't a joke anymore. It was a witness. That night, she finally opened Thomas's reply to her last message. He had reviewed the board's report and sent back a formal response draft. Clear, unemotional, built entirely on legal terms. It rejected the validity of the cited violations on procedural grounds, requested a full disclosure of the rule-passing process, and demanded proof that the updated compliance criteria had been voted on by a majority of property owners. Thomas added a final line. "This will stall them. It won't stop them." It wasn't a warning. It was a calibration. Leah understood. She signed the document, scanned it, and sent it back to his office for delivery. 2 days passed without a word. On the third morning, her internet cut out. No storm, no outage alerts from the provider, just gone. When she called to report it, the technician claimed the service request had been canceled 2 days prior. Leah hadn't made any cancellation. She asked for a copy of the request log, and the agent hesitated before saying it would have to be sent by mail. Something tightened in her chest, not from fear, but from that same deep frustration she had felt since the first letter had arrived. Everything was being picked apart in small, deniable increments. Nothing overt, nothing that warranted retaliation, but enough to remind her again and again that the ground beneath her wasn't stable. That same afternoon, a white envelope appeared in her mailbox, hand-addressed, no stamp. Inside was a single sheet, printed on official letterhead but unsigned. Your property has been selected for a community review panel discussion. Attendance is optional but recommended. Your presence can help resolve future misunderstandings regarding visual standards and land use expectations. The location was a familiar one, the same community center where the board held its monthly assemblies. But this wasn't a scheduled event. There had been no prior mention of it in any bulletin. It was an ambush disguised as inclusion. Leah didn't attend. She knew what would happen there. She would be outnumbered, talked over, handed forms, asked questions framed as accusations. Instead, she spent that hour going through her older records, documents Mason had left behind, including original property surveys and correspondence from the previous neighborhood committee. She found, buried beneath faded utility invoices and handwritten notes, a thick envelope containing a notarized agreement. Dated 7 years ago, it stated explicitly that the property in question was excluded from mandatory participation in any aesthetic oversight regulations passed after January 1st of that year, as a condition of prior non-participation. The document was signed by 2 previous board members and sealed. Mason had insisted on autonomy and had secured it in writing. Leah scanned the document and sent it to Thomas. His response was immediate. This changes everything. But just as quickly came the warning. They'll challenge it. They'll say the exemption expired, that bylaws have changed. But this gives us leverage. It proves precedent. The following morning, she received a phone call from a number she didn't recognize. She let it ring twice before answering. The voice on the other end was male, unhurried, vaguely pleasant. He introduced himself only as Alex, said he was a volunteer with the Neighborhood Advisory Group. He thanked her for her patience during recent reviews and said he wanted to personally extend an apology for the confusion around her property's status. "We recognize this has been a trying time," he said, the smile in his voice too polished, too rehearsed, "and we're hoping to avoid any unnecessary entanglements." Leah listened without responding. He continued, suggesting that if she would consider temporarily adjusting the appearance of her property, perhaps moving some of the wood into less visible zones, maybe dismantling the artistic assembly near the fence, they could help her avoid additional notices. "This doesn't have to become complicated," he said. That was when she understood the game fully. They weren't trying to win. They were trying to wear her down, 1 inch at a time. She thanked him calmly and hung up. Then she walked to the shop, took down the sealed document from its new place above her desk, and began drawing up a plan. Not just for her defense, but for a response that would leave no room for interpretation. If they wanted compliance, they would get structure. If they wanted silence, they would get records. If they wanted to push her from her own land, they would have to fight for every nail, every stone, every cut of wood stacked beneath her roof. The midpoint wasn't surrender, it was the end of hesitation. The days that followed moved with a peculiar stillness, not the kind that offered peace or rest, but a deceptive quiet that made every door creak feel amplified, every motion outside the window seem loaded with intention. Leah could sense the shift, not in any overt way, but in how the mail arrived slightly later than usual, how passing cars lingered just a breath longer near the gate, how the sound of distant voices from neighboring properties seemed more frequent, less casual. There was a pattern forming, and it wasn't made from coincidence. It was structure in shadow, a design that operated without signatures or declarations, but with the relentless gravity of something deeply organized. She stopped responding to unknown numbers. She let the voicemails collect, their messages growing increasingly vague, filled with phrases like next steps, community unity, and further opportunities for alignment. She kept a log of every call, every visit, every deviation from the ordinary. It wasn't paranoia. It was documentation, the only armor she could wear without drawing more fire. Then, one morning, her gate wouldn't open. Not locked, not jammed. Just physically blocked from the outside by a chain wrapped through the latch and looped around the post, sealed with a padlock that wasn't hers. She checked the cameras. Nothing. They'd been wiped. Not disabled, not broken, just cut off from power sometime around 3 a.m., the feed dropping into static and never returning. Whoever did it knew the layout. They avoided the sensor range, stepped quietly across gravel, and left no trace except the chain and a single laminated notice zip-tied to the fencing. Pending review. Visual violation escalation zone. Restricted exterior alteration. No signature, no seal, just bureaucracy disguised as legality. She didn't call the police. There was nothing to report that would be taken seriously. Trespassing implied harm, and this, in its twisted, papered form, was an adjustment. That same day, Thomas arrived in person. He hadn't warned her, hadn't called ahead. He just showed up in his dust-covered sedan, wearing a thin blazer and dark sunglasses. A man who looked like he hadn't had a full night's sleep in at least 3 days. He didn't speak as he walked the perimeter with her, pausing now and then to inspect fence posts, glance toward the trees lining the west side, take photos on a disposable camera. When they stepped into the workshop, he sat without invitation at the drafting table, pulling a manila folder from his bag. "This is about control, not compliance," he said. "They're trying to corner you into signing something." That chain wasn't about restriction. It was about baiting you into a reaction. If you'd cut it, they'd call it destruction of shared property. Leah leaned against the workbench, arms crossed, silent. Thomas continued, explaining that he'd dug deeper into the recent property sales around her area. The same 3 corporate names had begun appearing repeatedly in public records, tied to purchases made after failed compliance resolutions. None of them operated under development banners. They weren't builders. They were shell buyers, entities used to transfer ownership and hold land while keeping true investors hidden. It wasn't a real estate game. It was removal by attrition. Build enough pressure, trigger enough fines, suspend enough utilities, and eventually, most owners either fled or sold out quietly. Leah's refusal to move, speak publicly, or respond emotionally had turned her from target to obstacle. "They don't want to beat you," Thomas said. "They want to wear you out until you remove yourself." That night, as Thomas drove back toward town, Leah sat in the doorway of the workshop, staring out at the sculpture that had, in some strange way, sparked everything. It was still standing, unchanged, untouched, but its presence now was different. It wasn't mockery anymore. It was declaration, a monument to the line she would not cross. She slept in the workshop that night, not out of fear, but out of necessity. The next day she filed a civil complaint, not against the board, but against the unidentified entity that had locked her gate. She attached photos, timestamps, notes. Thomas filed a motion alongside it requesting a temporary injunction against any external modification to her property, citing personal safety and the violation of her right to private use of land. The process would take time, but it sent a message. She wasn't reacting emotionally. She was documenting. She was pressing back with precision. 3 days later, retaliation came in a new form. Her utility bill doubled, then tripled, within 2 billing cycles. When she called to dispute the charges, she was informed that manual adjustments had been made to the property's usage classification. When she asked for records, she was told to submit a formal request through municipal channels, which could take up to 30 days to process. She filed it anyway. She saved every receipt, every confirmation number. 2 nights after that, she returned from a supply run to find the side of her house sprayed with a foul-smelling substance, thick, tar-like, clinging to the siding and window frames. No signature, no message, just degradation. She documented it. Filed a police report. Nothing came of it, but she kept the photos, added them to the file. And then came the fire. It wasn't large, not destructive. Just enough to scorch the edge of the grass near her western property line. Just enough to singe the outer bark of a stack of green ash logs she'd been seasoning for 6 months. It had burned quick, controlled, as if someone had used accelerant in a ring and let it burn itself out. No natural cause. No lightning. No dropped cigarette. It was a message, written in flame. She didn't call the fire department. She called Thomas. He contacted a fire forensics consultant, who came 2 days later, took samples, and confirmed. Man-made, deliberate, low heat, rapid extinguish. The report didn't name names, but it confirmed intent. Leah sat alone that night, lights off, blinds drawn, sipping tea that had long since gone cold, the heat of the mug now just residual memory. She had not cried. She had not broken. But the fatigue was beginning to settle into her bones in a way she couldn't shake. Her routines felt heavier, her movements slower. It wasn't fear. It was weight. The weight of knowing that she was no longer dealing with policy, but with pressure, strategic and patient. She remembered something Mason had once said when she was a teenager, after she'd smashed a bowl in anger and blamed the shelf for being crooked. Destruction is easy. Precision takes patience. And control only matters if you understand what it costs you to lose it. She finally understood what he meant. The next morning, Leah called a licensed land surveyor. When he arrived, she instructed him to perform a full boundary survey of her property, checking not just for fence alignment, but for line encroachments, buried markers, utility access points, anything that could be used against her in court or leveraged for future complaints. It took 3 days. At the end, he handed her a digital file and a printed copy. "Everything's clean," he said. "No violations, no encroachments. You're solid." She sent copies to Thomas. That night, 2 signs appeared in her yard. One read, "Review pending, unauthorized structure." The other, "Visual compliance review, failed." They were staked in with steel rods laminated against weather and positioned in plain sight of the road. She didn't remove them. She built 2 new frames from scrap walnut and mounted the signs inside them. Then she staked a 3rd sign beneath them, carved by hand, burned into the wood. Context matters. So does truth. And she left them there. Not as surrender, but as record. Let them come. The escalation had reached a point where Leah no longer expected civility, only timing. She moved through her days with a silent vigilance. Not paranoid, but exact, watching for patterns, listening for inconsistencies in noise, tracking movements with a mechanical clarity that didn't allow room for emotion. The signs remained in her yard, their messages reframed by the handcrafted walnut mounts she had built not as defiance, but as annotation. She understood now that every interaction, every printed form or unexpected silence, every visit or conveniently missing package was part of a long, calculated strategy meant to exhaust her into submission. But exhaustion, while unavoidable, was not the same as defeat. Her hands still worked, her tools still responded, and, most importantly, her claim to the land remained intact, even as the space around it became increasingly hostile. Then came the letter that shifted everything, not because of what it said, but because of where it came from. Unlike the others, it didn't arrive in a cheap white envelope or laminated sheath. It was hand-delivered by a courier, pressed into her palm with an apologetic nod and a refusal to make eye contact. The envelope was heavy, textured, stamped with the seal of the county recorder's office. Inside was a formal notice of hearing, an official request for Leah Savage to appear before the Regional Zoning Variance Board regarding non-compliant permanent structures constructed without prior environmental or aesthetic authorization. No mention of the committee, no mention of visual violations. This wasn't about her front yard anymore. It was a procedural strike from the next tier of authority, one level higher, cloaked in the legitimacy of jurisdiction and procedure. The hearing date was in 13 days. She didn't panic. She didn't make phone calls or rally support. She took the document to Thomas, who sat with it in silence for nearly 10 minutes, flipping it over in his hands as though trying to feel for hidden layers beneath the text. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured. They're escalating jurisdictionally now. That means someone with reach, money, backing, or personal connections pushed this upward. Leah asked what it meant in practical terms. It means we're out of informal zones. It's real now. Evidence, precedent, and public record will decide the outcome, and someone is betting on you either breaking or making a mistake. Leah didn't break. Over the next 11 days, she and Thomas assembled a full case file. It included photos, timestamps, affidavits from the fire forensics expert and surveyor, notarized documentation of prior property exemption status, evidence of procedural inconsistencies in how local enforcement was applied, and a comparative visual analysis of surrounding properties demonstrating selective enforcement. Thomas also prepared a formal challenge to the jurisdictional leap, questioning the board's authority to refer the matter to the county level without first resolving procedural conflicts at the local level. They worked late into each night, sharpening language, aligning dates, cross-checking sequences. Leah barely slept, not because of anxiety, but because her body had slipped into a mode of relentless concentration. She ate methodically, showered only when she remembered, and kept her focus fixed not on the outcome but on the clarity of process. She didn't fantasize about victory. She imagined accuracy. The day of the hearing arrived with wind, hot, sharp gusts that pushed dust across the highway and rattled loose signage outside the municipal building. Leah wore dark jeans, a clean cotton shirt, and her father's old watch. She carried a thin leather folder with her name engraved into the corner and didn't speak to anyone as she passed through security. Thomas was already waiting inside, his blazer pressed, shoes polished, every document filed in color-coded tabs. The hearing room was smaller than she expected. No rows of wooden benches or microphones, just a long U-shaped table, 6 panelists, and a single standing podium flanked by 2 chairs. The air was dry, the kind that pulls moisture from your tongue before you even try to speak. As the hearing began, Leah didn't look at the panelists. She watched the audience seats behind her, where several familiar faces sat scattered. Neighbors who had watched silently from behind hedges and curtains for months, now drawn in by the potential for spectacle or closure. Thomas opened with the documentation. His delivery was precise, not passionate. He explained the context, outlined the legal precedents, referenced the exemptions, and questioned the board's failure to follow procedural requirements. He introduced each piece of evidence without embellishment, trusting in the architecture of facts. When it was Leah's turn to speak, she didn't recount the harassment or the sleepless nights. She spoke only of the process, the stacking of wood, the documentation of property boundaries, the sculpture as a non-commercial, non-electrical outdoor installation made entirely from naturally sourced material. She used their own terms. She didn't perform. She presented. When the opposing representative took the podium, a man named Fuller, dressed in a tailored gray suit and smiling with that practiced stillness of institutional authority, he did not reference rules or documents. He spoke instead of tone, of disruption to shared harmony, of uncooperative participants. He used the phrase hostile resistance to normative expectations 3 times. He never once cited policy. The panel asked questions, some procedural, some designed to test nerves. One asked whether Leah believed she had an obligation to consider the shared psychological environment of her neighborhood when deciding how her yard appeared. She didn't flinch. She replied that she believed in lawful boundaries and individual responsibility, and that she did not recognize psychological environment as a measurable or enforceable term. When the hearing closed, the panel announced they would issue a ruling in 7 days. No immediate judgment, just silence. On the way back, Leah didn't speak. She rolled down the window and let the dry air whip past her face, her jaw locked, hands steady. She didn't feel victorious. She felt hollowed out, like someone who had just finished lifting something much heavier than expected, not realizing until afterward how much it had taken out of her. When she returned home, everything looked the same. Fence, gravel, the sculpture still seated in its dignified silence. But on the porch, taped to the door in a crooked line, was a new notice. It wasn't official. No seal, no letterhead. Just a single sentence, typed in 14-point font. You made it complicated. She removed it without a word, burned it in the same forge she used for her carvings, and went inside. The ruling came on a Friday morning, slipped into her mailbox in a thin envelope bearing the seal of the Zoning Variance Board. Leah didn't rush to open it. She held it in her hand for a few minutes, standing in the center of her yard where the dust had settled and the air hung heavy with late autumn heat. There was no drama in the moment, no music, no wind to lift the corners of the paper in cinematic fashion. Just her and the envelope, and the quiet certainty that whatever was inside, she had already endured more than most would have dared. When she opened it, her eyes didn't skim or scan. She read each word, slowly, deliberately, until she reached the 3rd paragraph. In review of all presented evidence, prior exemptions, procedural irregularities, and structural classifications, the board finds in favor of the respondent, Mrs. Leah Savage. No violation determined. All penalties nullified. Review process closed. That was it. No apology, no explanation. No acknowledgement of the months she'd spent under quiet siege. Just a bureaucratic conclusion. She sat on the porch that afternoon, not in celebration but in stillness. Her hands rested loosely in her lap, and her eyes scanned the horizon without expectation. Across the street, one neighbor passed by in his truck without looking at her. Another walked their dog on the opposite side of the road, eyes down, pace quickened. There were no congratulations, no visits, just absence, an intentional silence, not from lack of awareness, but from an instinctive distance people kept from anything that made them question comfort or compliance. Leah wasn't surprised. She hadn't fought for their approval, and she didn't expect gratitude. What she had fought for was something quieter, heavier, the right to exist without permission. Over the next few days, the phone calls stopped. The strange cars stopped passing by. The signs in her yard remained untouched. No new letters arrived. The silence was different now. Less sharp, more defeated. It was the sound of people retreating, not regrouping. The absence of harassment wasn't kindness. It was an admission. They hadn't succeeded, and now they were leaving her alone because they didn't know what else to do. The damage, of course, had already been done. Not to her home, not to her record, but to her sense of ease. Even victory felt more like survival than triumph. She didn't dismantle the sculpture. She didn't repaint the house or move the wood stacks out of view. She left everything where it was, not out of spite, but as a kind of living record. People could pass by and choose to ignore it. Or they could look at it and wonder what had happened here. What story had unfolded in silence while they tended their lawns and read their compliance newsletters. Her land was no longer just space. It was testimony. She'd won, technically, but the truth was there had never really been a win, just a refusal to be erased. One evening, just before dusk, a boy on a bicycle stopped at her fence. He was maybe 12, curious in that quiet, awkward way most kids are when they're caught between innocence and awareness. He looked at the sculpture for a long time, and then at Leah, who sat on the porch with her usual cup of cooling coffee. "Is it a statue of someone important?" he asked. His voice wasn't mocking, just curious. Leah smiled, the first time in days she'd felt her face shift from neutral into something warmer. "To some people, maybe," she said. "To others, just a reminder." The boy nodded, not understanding fully but satisfied enough to ride off. Leah watched the road until he disappeared. The air was still. Her land was quiet. The fences stood, the trees whispered, and the workshop lights began to flicker on as the last of the sun dipped